My youth in New Jersey. If you'd ever driven down the winding, tree-lined streets of Maplewood, New Jersey, you might have thought you were looking at a postcard version of suburban America. Neat lawns, golden retrievers, neighbors waving from kitchen windows. That was my world for most of my childhood and early teens. To outsiders, my life must have seemed idyllic, even privileged. Our two-story colonial home stood on a quiet cul-de-sac, and every Sunday afternoon smelled of fresh-baked bread or barbecue drifting from open backyard doors. I was the only child in a family that valued appearances, success, and tradition. My mother, Claire Parker, was the heart of our home, a devoted parent with an infectious laugh who believed every little celebration deserved a homemade cake. My father, Daniel, was an attorney, always pressed and punctual. He worked long hours, but when he was home, he moved through the house with a kind of gravity. His approval meant everything to me. After my mother died when I was 12, a cold draft crept into that warm, sunlit house. Grief is not melodramatic most of the time. It's silent, heavy, and sneaks into ordinary moments, like every Christmas when I missed her singing off-key with the radio, or every award I wanted to show her. My father became quieter, more absorbed by his work. In those lonely years, my Aunt Jane, my mom's younger sister, stepped in and filled the void. She moved into the guest room, telling me bedtime stories and brushing the knots out of my hair in the morning. Jane always smelled of vanilla. She told me that secrets didn't last long in small towns, and that family secrets were the heaviest of all. School was neither heaven nor hell for me. I was a decent student, AP English, debate team, the occasional school play. My friends called me responsible, reliable, an old soul. I spent weekends at the town library or helping Jane plant lavender in the garden. I wasn't the wild kid sneaking out, nor was I the picture-perfect cheerleader on the front page of the yearbook. I guess I always felt sort of in between, loved, but also a little lonely, content, but restless. Every summer, Jane and I would drive down to the Jersey Shore, singing loudly to oldies on the radio, her left arm tanned from the open window. Those long car rides were filled with her stories, some about her childhood, some about my mother's mischievous side, and some, I'd later realize, were warnings wrapped in riddles about trust and betrayal. But at the time, all I could think about was salt water on my skin and the thrill of feeling young and free. Looking back, those years feel almost golden, cast in a forgiving light. I didn't notice the cracks in the foundation, the subtle ways money and grief changed the energy in our house. I didn't see that behind every perfectly posed holiday card was a tension we all tried to ignore. The Parker family secret, as Jane used to joke, was that everyone forced a smile for the camera, no matter what. If you asked the neighbors then, they'd say I was a lucky girl. And for a long time, I believed it too. But childhood is a country you think you can visit whenever you want, only to learn that the roads back there are one way. What I didn't know was that all the trust, comfort, and certainty I'd grown up with were the very things that would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. Trust built from childhood. From the time I was very young, trust was never something I questioned. It was the air I breathed. In our household, routines were sacred, and the unspoken promise was that family meant security, safety, and certainty. Even after losing my mother, the foundation of trust didn't crumble all at once. If anything, it became an anchor, something I clung to with both hands as our lives shifted in ways I couldn't yet understand. Aunt Jane was the embodiment of that trust. She wasn't just my mother's younger sister. She became my confidant, mentor, and a gentle shield against the uncertainties that followed loss. She moved into our home when I was 12, and, from the beginning, made it clear that she was there for as long as we needed each other. I remember those first few nights with her in the guest room across the hall, the soft glow under her door, the sound of her voice as she read out loud, the scent of vanilla and chamomile from her nightly cup of tea. Jane found ways to make the house feel less empty. She filled our kitchen with homemade muffins and Sunday pancakes, always adding a little extra sugar for me. Jane had an uncanny ability to notice things that others missed. When I needed an extra hug, when a joke had stung, or when I was hovering between childhood and an uncomfortable new adolescence, she would brush my hair in the mornings like my mom once did, reminding me quietly that no one is truly alone, not with family beside them. "We stick together, Em," she would say, squeezing my hand. "No matter what the world throws at us, there's something powerful about being able to confide in someone without fear of ridicule or betrayal." Jane encouraged me to be honest, to share every worry or secret, no matter how small. I told her about the notes I passed with friends at school, my first crush on an older boy who worked at the public library, and about the nightmares that would sometimes jerk me awake at midnight. She never judged, never dismissed what mattered to me. If anything, she treated my anxieties with the same importance as her own. Trust isn't just built on grand gestures. It's rooted in thousands of small, everyday moments. Jane showed up for my school recitals, cheered at my track meets, and always had a listening ear when I wanted to vent about teachers or classmates. She became my bridge to the world my mother had left behind, telling stories of their childhood adventures and sometimes their secret sibling rivalries. Through Jane's stories, I felt connected to both the past and the present, never feeling truly alone, despite the gaping absence in our family. When I remember those years, I recall the sense of safety I carried with me, an assurance that as long as Jane was there, nothing truly terrible could happen. That trust became the lens through which I viewed not only her, but my entire family. It shaded my world in reassuring colors, and even on the hardest days, it made me believe in kindness, loyalty, and the goodness of the people closest to me. I suppose that's why, later on, the pain of betrayal cut so deep, not just because of what was lost, but because I had never imagined a world where trust could be so thoroughly upended. But at that time, I simply believed family was everything, and Jane, my aunt, my friend, my guardian, would never let me down. The tragedy of betrayal. In stories, betrayal is often sudden, a knife in the back, a dramatic reveal, a gasp, tears. But in real life, betrayal creeps in quietly, slowly, like a crack in the foundation of a home that you don't see until the walls begin to buckle. Looking back, I can't point to a single moment when everything changed, but rather a series of almost imperceptible shifts, each chipping away at the certainty and trust that had defined so much of my life. I wish I'd recognized the signs. I wish I'd asked harder questions. But when harm comes from someone you love, someone you thought loved you in return, denial is easy and comfortingly oft. It started, as such things often do, with secrets. Not shadowy figures in the night or mysterious phone calls, but small things that felt off. Lingering questions that I brushed aside because the alternative, to doubt Jane, after everything, was too painful to consider. I noticed her in quiet conversations on the phone, her voice low and hurried when she didn't know I was nearby, or the way she would close her laptop when I entered a room. When I asked, she smiled and told me not to worry, that adulthood was filled with boring stuff, like bills and family paperwork. Around that time, my father became more distant, less patient, more absorbed in work, sometimes short with me in a way I'd never experienced. The house felt different, colder. Jane tried to fill the gaps. She cooked elaborate meals, went out of her way to check in on me, arranged family game nights. I told myself she was just trying to help, to hold us together, but the warmth felt performative, like a mask. The first real crack appeared with the money. I overheard Jane and my father arguing in the kitchen one night, not in raised voices, but in intense, hurried whispers. My name was mentioned. I pressed my ear to the stairwell, my heart pounding. Bank statements. Something missing. Emily's not a child anymore. I wanted to run down and demand answers, but I was afraid, not just of what I might hear, but of bringing disharmony into the fragile peace our family had managed to maintain. Soon after, small things began to shift. My debit card was declined at a bookstore, even though I hadn't spent much at all. My college account was suddenly on hold over unpaid fees I didn't understand. When I asked Jane, she said she would handle it, that financial matters were complicated since Mom had died, and that my father was under a lot of stress. I wanted to believe her, but unease spread inside me like cold water. She always offered explanations, never angry or defensive, just calm, full of rationalizations that made me feel ridiculous for even asking. Then came the accusation. My father confronted me one evening, his face grave, his voice tight. There had been a theft. The family safe, which contained my mother's jewelry and several important documents, had been opened. Items were missing, gone without explanation, and Jane had told my father that she'd seen me near the safe that afternoon. The room spun. My mind struggled to process the words. Jane said, "What?" I was numb with disbelief. I denied everything, of course, but doubt flickered in my father's eyes, a doubt I had never seen before. News spread fast. The next day, I felt it at school, the way friends glanced at me, whispered behind my back. Someone must have told their parents, who told someone else. Maplewood was a small town, and secrets, as Jane liked to say, never stayed buried for long. Suddenly, invitations faded, calls went unanswered, and the teachers seemed to treat me just a bit differently, as if they saw a shadow over me now. I tried to talk to Jane, desperate to understand. She was gentle, almost sorrowful, telling me that sometimes when we're hurting, we do things we don't mean. I felt like I was the one losing my mind, accused of something I'd never do, unable to prove my innocence. Even worse, I began to doubt my own memory. Had I somehow forgotten locking the safe? Had I been careless? The more I tried to recall the day, the more everything blurred, as if my mind was protecting me from something unspeakable. The hardest part was watching my father. He didn't yell or punish me, but our relationship changed. He no longer asked me about my day or offered the proud half-smile I treasured. At breakfast, silence filled the room. Jane kept up her cheerful demeanor, offering pancakes, nudging small talk, but my father only nodded, only answered when spoken to. I felt my world shrinking, each day a little colder, lonelier. At night, I lay awake, replaying every conversation, every moment in the house. I began to notice things. The shift in Jane's tone when discussing finances, the way she spoke about my mother's legacy. "It's for the good of the family, Em. Your mom would have wanted us to be careful." One evening, I overheard her once again on the phone, talking to a lawyer, discussing transfers of assets and guardianship extensions. When I confronted her, she said it was simply estate work, and not to worry. Again, she managed to say the exact words to make me feel small, naive, but I couldn't ignore reality any longer. The bank finally sent a letter addressed to me, confirming that the last of my college fund had been withdrawn. The signature wasn't mine. It was Jane's, shaky, but there. Rage and heartbreak mixed in my chest, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was methodical, calculated. Jane had taken not just my mother's inheritance, but my future too. The betrayal was total, not just financial, but emotional and spiritual. I lost friends, my standing in the community, and the one place I thought would never fail me, my family. For a while, I moved as if underwater, numbed by the loss, haunted by the question that still sometimes visits me in the dark. How could someone who'd once tucked a blanket around my shoulders do this to me? How could love and trust be hollowed out and weaponized? It's strange, the way betrayal forces you to grow up all at once. I could no longer afford to be the naive, trusting child I had been. My grief morphed into anger, and then, slowly, into resolve. Jane's words echoed in my mind, twisted now. Family secrets are the heaviest of all. I realized I'd been carrying a secret, a belief in unconditional love, that wasn't shared by everyone under my roof. It was time to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The world as I knew it had collapsed, but in the ruins, I felt the first spark of a new strength rising. Not because I was unscarred, but because pain had finally broken the spell of silence. The cost of betrayal was immense, but I had already paid in innocence. I would not pay in silence. The decision not to remain silent. For a while, I convinced myself that silence was the safer path, that if I just endured, things would eventually right themselves. I told myself that Jane's betrayal was a nightmare I could eventually wake up from, and that if I kept the peace, some vital part of my family might still be salvaged. But there is a peculiar pain in being accused of something you haven't done, especially by those who shaped your sense of right and wrong. The injustice of it built up inside me, heavy and volatile, until enduring no longer felt noble. It felt suffocating. The turning point wasn't a single event, a letter, an argument, a new indignity. Instead, it was a gradual awakening, as if the sunlight was finally reaching the darkest corners of what my life had become. Grief, which had once numbed me, slowly morphed into something sharper, a fierce determination not to let what happened to me define the rest of my life. I still remember the morning I woke up and could pinpoint, for the first time, the fierce ache along my spine as courage. That was when I decided I would not stay silent. I needed to reclaim my story, not just for me, but for the memory of my mother, for the girl I used to be before betrayal made me a stranger in my own skin. The first steps, gathering courage and allies, making the decision was one thing. Acting on it, especially in the face of so much isolation, was another. My father barely spoke to me now, and Jane had cemented herself as both matriarch and martyr in our household. The narrative she'd spun, that I was somehow to blame, or at least troubled and rebellious, hung over me everywhere I went, a fog I couldn't dispel with facts alone. But if there was one thing I'd inherited from both my mother's faith in people and my father's stubbornness, it was the ability to keep going, to move quietly when everyone else had written me off. I started small. I kept a journal of little inconsistencies, what Jane said to me, what I overheard her say to others, dates and times of strange interactions or missing paperwork. At school, I clung to the few friends who hadn't abandoned me in the wake of scandal. though I found it almost impossible to trust anyone fully. I studied their faces, looked for flickers of doubt or pity, and wondered, if I ever told them everything, would they believe me? Would anyone? I found unexpected support in Mrs. Callahan, my AP English teacher. She wasn't typical of the adults I usually confided in. She was brisk, sarcastic, the kind of woman who wore bright scarves and never sugar-coated anything. After class one day, she caught me lingering behind and asked, with brutal kindness, "Do you want to talk about what's really going on?" Something in her tone, matter-of-fact, uncompromising, made me trust her with the raw, tentative edges of my story. She listened without interruption, then said, "The truth has a stubborn way of coming out. Sometimes you have to help it along." With her encouragement, I found the number for the legal aid office in Newark, the city just north of Maplewood. It felt surreal, sitting in the kitchen, listening to Jane hum as she loaded the dishwasher, while I secretly drafted emails to lawyers on my phone under the table. Each message was a defiant act, a signal to myself that I refused to be erased. The process of building a case, gathering evidence, was both exhausting and terrifying. I had so little to go on. Some odd bank transactions I'd managed to intercept in the mail, screenshots of emails Jane had left open on the family computer, notes from overheard conversations. I became a watcher, noticing every detail, timing my movements to avoid Jane whenever possible. The safe, which had once been a symbol of security, was now the epicenter of suspicion. On a day when Jane and my father both left for a supposed meeting with the estate lawyer, I found the spare key to Jane's desk and slipped into her room. My hands shook as I rummaged through folders, bills, statements, and finally a printed document naming Jane as sole beneficiary of a trust I'd never heard of. The Kim signature, scrawled next to my mother's printed name, was unmistakably Boyer. My skin crawled as I photographed the document with my phone, but I also felt a strange exhilaration. Proof, no matter how small. I soon realized that to untangle Jane's web, I needed help outside the family. People who wouldn't be swayed by her good aunt routine. With growing desperation, I pressed my father for answers. He deflected, his voice drained and wary, as though he no longer trusted his own judgment. "You know Jane handles all the paperwork these days, Em," he said. "She's been helping us since you were a child." There was no anger or accusation in his tone anymore, just fatigue and surrender. I started spending time at the library again, but I wasn't reading novels. Instead, I pored over volumes about estate law, power of attorney, and the rights of adult children in inheritance disputes. I filled legal pads with notes, diagrams, timelines, any clue that could help me piece together the labyrinth Jane had created. Finding my voice, the power of documentation. It was then that I bought a small voice recorder with the leftover funds from my summer job. At first, I kept it on me for accidental confessions, but soon I realized Jane had a habit of making calls in the kitchen when she thought everyone was out. I set up my phone behind the bread box, hidden among cookbooks. Some of the conversations I captured were ordinary, grocery lists, reminders, but others chilled me. Discussions with a lawyer about transferring assets while she's still underage. Reminders to keep Daniel out of the loop. One night, I caught her whispering my name and unstable mental health in the same sentence. The more I gathered, the braver I became. I began saving every scrap. Old birthday emails from my mother mentioning the trust fund. Statements from my college's bursar office indicating payment failures. Receipts Jane had signed with shaky imitations of my father's name. I even accessed home security video footage, combing through hours of pixelated silence until, inevitably, I caught Jane entering my father's study late at night. The same days, withdrawals were made from my account. At some point, I realized the stakes had changed. This was no longer just about proving my innocence. It was about reclaiming my agency, my very sense of reality. How much of my life had been shaped by lies I never saw coming? How many times had Jane smiled at me, brushed my hair, and concocted stories to keep me compliant and close? Emotional toll and small triumphs. There were nights I couldn't sleep, haunted by memories of a simpler time. I'd scroll through photos, me and Jane at the Jersey shore, sand between our toes and sunburn on our foreheads, and wonder which parts of our relationship, if any, had ever been real. I'd replay the bridge of trust we'd built, brick by brick, and imagine Jane pulling each stone loose while I slept. Still, there were moments of grace. Mrs. Callahan checked in on me regularly, bringing me books about resilience and sending emails with nothing more than a quote or a funny meme. My friend Hannah, one of the only people who hadn't ghosted me after the scandal, started walking home with me from school again. No questions asked. These gestures stitched a little hope back into my days. One afternoon, Hannah found me typing a timeline of events in the library. I hesitated, but when she asked, "You're trying to prove something, aren't you?" I nodded. After a long pause, she offered gently, "You can use my old laptop if you want. No one in your house needs to know." It felt like a lifeline, a small act of kindness that made the world seem a little less hostile. From then on, I kept my evidence on a hidden USB drive, tucked in my backpack under a row of yellow highlighters, narrowing down the truth. By the time spring rolled around, I had gathered enough to see the broader contours of Jane's betrayal. She had transferred funds from my mother's accounts in small, careful increments over several years, always leaving just enough to avoid suspicion. She had written emails to lawyers, masquerading as my father, occasionally as me, all designed to consolidate her control of the estate. The most damning evidence, though, was the constellation of moments I'd documented. A casual slip, an impatient sigh, a shadow crossing her face when certain subjects came up. None of this was enough, legally, to bring her down, but it was enough to convince me I wasn't imagining things, that the years of trust I'd invested in Jane had been betrayed in carefully calculated steps. I decided it was time to go public, or as public as I dared. With Mrs. Callahan's guidance, I met with a pro bono attorney in Newark. Sitting across from Ms. Alvarez, her desk strewn with files and photographs of her own children, I laid out everything I'd collected. She listened intently, sometimes shaking her head in disbelief, sometimes scribbling notes. "This is good, Emily," she said. "It's not everything we need, but it's a start. I'll help you, but you need to prepare for the fallout. This will get messy." Crossing the threshold, messy didn't begin to cover it. Ms. Alvarez arranged meetings with the local police, who listened to my account and agreed to investigate possible financial impropriety. There were interviews, document reviews, more questions than answers. The process was slow, bureaucratic, often discouraging. I would return home, heart racing, terrified. Jane would sense my newfound resolve and destroy the evidence before I could act. But each day, the silence became easier to break, the weight on my chest a little lighter. What surprised me most was my own resilience. People talk about fight or flight, but there's also freeze. Those moments when you want to vanish, to dissolve into the walls. In sharing my story, in handing over the weight of my secret, I discovered that courage isn't loud or brazen. It's quiet, steady, a series of small steps forward, even when the path is shrouded in doubt. At one point, I confronted my father, this time armed with facts rather than fear. I showed him the statements, the digital paper trail, the video clips. He listened silently, his face drawn and ashen. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. "I'm so sorry, Em. I should have protected you better." It wasn't vindication, not yet, but it was a chink in Jane's armor, a restoration of a threadbare father-daughter bond, determination, hope, and the road ahead. Perhaps the hardest lesson was accepting that exposing the truth wouldn't heal every wound. Some family members clung to Jane's narrative, unwilling to believe their sister, daughter, or aunt could be capable of such betrayal. At community gatherings, whispers sometimes grew louder, and the old chill of ostracism occasionally returned. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was not willing to shrink again, not willing to shape myself around other people's comfort. In the end, the choice to speak up, to break the cycle of silence and complicity, wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming the right to define myself, to draw the boundaries of my own life. What Jane took from me was real: money, security, trust. But what she tried and failed to take was the core of who I am: persistent, resilient, unwilling to let shame or fear decide my fate. I wish I could say this ended with a single dramatic confrontation, the kind you see in movies. In reality, it was a series of hard conversations, document exchanges, sleepless nights, and finally, the knowledge that the truth was moving, inexorably, into the light. There was no erasing the harm that had been done, but by refusing to stay silent, I learned that even the deepest betrayal could be answered. Not with vengeance, but with truth. And in that truth, I found the start of freedom. Step by step, reclaiming justice. No one tells you that seeking justice can be just as lonely as suffering injustice. The world doesn't stop spinning so you can set things right. You get up, go to work or school, see familiar faces that now look at you differently, and meanwhile, you carry this electric storm in your chest, the knowledge that everything you believed in has been twisted, but you'll be damned if you let that be the last word. In the early days, after meeting with Ms. Alvarez, the pro bono attorney, everything felt uncertain. We didn't hug or talk much at home. Our house, once the site of Sunday brunches and laughter, had become a psychological minefield. I learned to move quietly, to guard the evidence I'd painstakingly gathered, not just from Jane, but from anyone who might be tempted to dismiss it, or worse, make it disappear. Organizing the evidence. Ms. Alvarez showed me how to organize a case, not just emotionally, but as an investigator would. "The details matter," she said. "A good case is built like a brick wall, one fact at a time, with no weak points." I took that to heart. Every evening, I reviewed documents I'd photographed, receipts with forged signatures, bank statements showing pattern withdrawals, emails with dates I could cross-reference to phone logs. I created a master timeline, putting in every notable event, awkward family meetings, the dates money had gone missing, conversations I'd recorded on my phone. I made color-coded spreadsheets, one column for Jane, one for my dad, another for mysterious outside contacts. I became obsessed with patterns. When had Jane argued most with Dad? Did money go missing right after certain conversations? When I hit a wall, Ms. Alvarez would nudge me. Follow the money, but also follow the emotion. People leave trails when they're careless or desperate. Legal hurdles and false starts. I was naive to how slow the wheels of justice could turn. "The law rewards caution, not drama," Ms. Alvarez warned. My evidence while emotionally devastating, had to stand up to challenge. I sat through meticulous interviews with police detectives. They asked the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies, making me relive the worst moments over and over. Was I ever tempted to take the money myself? Had I ever threatened Jane? Did I understand the seriousness of my accusations? Yes, I told them. I understood it all too well. There were days when I left those sessions shaky and exhausted, convinced the world would always believe Jane, not me. Jane had always known how to charm adults. She visited the neighbors, smiled at church, commiserated with family friends about her troubled niece. Maplewood's grapevine hummed with versions of my story I didn't recognize. Emily is having money problems. She's jealous. She misses her mother and resents her dad's new closeness with Jane. But I had to keep moving. The hardest battle, I quickly realized, was not with Jane or even the police. It was with myself. Doubt stalked me constantly. Each time I added new evidence to my timeline, a voice in my head whispered, "What if you're reading this wrong? What if there's a simple explanation, and you're blowing up your family for nothing?" Seeking new allies. My faith in people was bruised, but not gone. I made a conscious decision to reach out, gently, cautiously, to those on the periphery of my life who might help. Mrs. Callahan, my teacher, kept checking on me, offering her classroom as a private workspace. She even suggested I contact her cousin, a journalist for a local paper. At first, I balked. This wasn't a story for gossip. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the power of public scrutiny. If Jane knew someone outside the family was watching, maybe she would think twice about doubling down on her lies. Over coffee in a quiet Newark cafe, I met with Katie, the journalist. She didn't promise to print anything. Ethical lines, she said, are especially fine when the subject is underage and the accused is family. But she offered guidance on organizing my evidence and pointed out where I was missing crucial corroboration. She explained how documentation wasn't just paper. It was photos, texts, social media posts, and even ordinary objects placed in context. With Katie's help, I requested bank video footage from disputed withdrawal dates, and I took screenshots of text messages that, on their own, sounded harmless, but against the right timeline, clearly revealed Jane's pressure campaigns or attempts to manipulate my father. Walking home after those kinds of meetings, my burden felt lighter, maybe because I finally believed I wasn't crazy for fighting. The power and pain of confrontation, between police interviews, attorney calls, and stressful home life. I lost sleep and appetite. My heart hurt all the time. A dull ache that ebbed and surged. More than once I was tempted to give up. Was fighting worth the years it would surely steal from my life? I kept remembering one of Jane's favorite phrases. The truth sets you free, but first it makes you miserable. The irony wasn't lost on me. The time eventually came for Jane to know I was fighting back. She walked into the kitchen one evening to find me reviewing files at the table. For the first time, I didn't hide what I was doing. I looked her in the eye. She deflected with ease, making tea, asking about my friends, but I watched the facade falter for a split second. That night, Jane tried the gentle approach, pulling out old family albums to reminisce, acting wounded by my mistrust. She said, "Not everything is how it looks, Emily. Families survive by forgiving, not by attacking each other." I stared at the pictures. My mother's smiling face beside Jane's, decades ago, in a world I no longer recognized. "Families survive by telling the truth, Jane," I said. "I'm tired of being afraid." Building toward a tipping point. The legal process dragged on. Subpoenas for account records, more lengthy interviews, repeated cross-checks of my timeline. Not everything went smoothly. At one point, a crucial email chain I'd saved disappeared from the family computer. I panicked, scouring every USB drive and sharing panicked calls with Ms. Alvarez, who reminded me to always back up my most sensitive evidence remotely. I started leaving digital breadcrumbs, copies of documents tucked away in cloud storage accounts Jane couldn't access. Every time I left the house for meetings, I wondered if Jane would accidentally erase something, or even plant new stories to discredit me. I double-checked everything, living half the time on adrenaline and half on raw hope. At school, rumors continued to swirl. One former friend, likely hearing from her parents, cornered me at my locker, asking, "Is it true you're taking your family to court? Don't you think you're blowing this up?" Her question stung, but not as much as my reply surprised me. Maybe if you lost everything you trusted overnight, you'd try to get it back too. In truth, I had lost friends, lost comfort, lost easy sleep. Maybe I was blowing it up, but it was already blown to bits the moment Jane betrayed me. The community begins to notice. Katie eventually published a blind item on financial abuse in families, not naming me or Jane, but the entire town read between the lines. Mixed reactions followed. Some people whispered about that Parker girl. Others looked at Jane with new wariness. My father, slow to emerge from the fog of denial, finally began to ask me questions. Not accusations, just honest uncertainty. "Are you sure about this, Em?" he murmured one night. I shared with him the timeline, the forged signatures, the evidence of his own name being used for withdrawals he hadn't approved. Watching him struggle between love, fear, and guilt reminded me. Justice wasn't just about revenge. It was about clarity. My goal was not to see Jane punished for its own sake, but to reclaim what was taken, my mother's legacy, my own chance at adulthood, our family's future. The law joins the fight months, blurred by in a haze of paperwork and police phone calls. Quiet detectives came and went, asking for access to Jane's computer, to paper records in my mother's old study. When the findings grew substantial enough, a formal investigation opened into possible fraud and forgery. I watched Jane stammer through her first interview, the mask of cool confidence slipping just a little when faced with signed affidavits, and her own words played back from my recordings. Media attention circled closer as well. More journalists asked Ms. Alvarez about a prominent Maplewood family under suspicion, while others in the community remembered that Jane had handled financial matters after my mother's death with unusual secrecy. The shock in their faces as the truth unfolded, some believed, some did not, marked another small victory in my campaign for actual justice. Not simply the appearance of harmony, the emotional cost. Throughout all this, my inner world was both brittle and resilient. My view of myself changed. I saw my own ability to endure, to analyze, to persist, even when dismissed. I missed my mother more than ever during this time, craving her gentle reassurances, wishing she were there to witness how hard I was fighting for what she left behind. Sometimes I allowed myself a moment to cry, to grieve not only for what I'd lost, but for the version of my family I'd believed to be real. But I also wrote long letters in a notebook addressed to my future self, promising I wouldn't let this story end in silence or defeat. Every piece of evidence collected, every hard conversation endured, reminded me I might have been made a victim, but I refused to live as one. Closing in on the truth, the closer the case got to resolution, the more I felt the beginnings of relief. Never total, because I knew winning wouldn't heal everything, but a sense that I could one day sleep without the weight of injustice pressing on my chest. Jane grew nervous, more volatile. She lashed out unexpectedly, then quickly returned to false sweetness, anxious to project innocence for anyone watching. On the day police completed their final report, Ms. Alvarez sat me down. "It's time," she said, sliding a copy of the report toward me. Every page was familiar. My words, my evidence, our pain, our hope. "You did this," she said. "No one else could have told this story, but you." I glanced down at my mother's photo, the faded Polaroid I kept in my wallet. I promised her, fiercely, silently, that I would finish what I'd started. Preparation for the last reveal. The wheels were set in motion for the confrontation I had dreaded and needed in equal measure. A family meeting, police present, lawyers ready, and even the local press notified by Katie to ensure transparency. I rehearsed what I would say for nights in a row, feeling every word like a stone in my gut. With each step, I reclaimed not only my family's legacy, but something bigger, my sense of self, forged in fire and truth. I knew there would be no easy catharsis. After months of investigation, accusation, and heartbreak, I was about to stake my claim on what I deserved, not just money, but the dignity of being heard. This was no longer just about righting a wrong, but about honoring the girl I used to be and the woman I was stubbornly becoming. And even as fear buzzed on the edge of my nerves, something else rooted deeper. The resolve of someone who stayed standing, even when forced to question everything, confronting the whole family in the name of justice. The morning of the family confrontation felt unreal, like that silent pause before a thunderstorm when the air vibrates with tension and anything seems possible, terrible, or redemptive. I woke before sunrise. For the first time in months, my resolve was steadier than my fear. I dressed carefully, favoring simple, unadorned clothes that made me feel grounded. Dark jeans, a navy sweater, my late mother's silver bracelet. On my bedside table, I'd placed everything I needed. My notebook, the voice recordings, emails, bank statements, legal briefs. Each piece of evidence, a stone in the dam I was about to break. As the hour approached, I rehearsed my words one last time. Not for victory, not for revenge, for truth and for voice. I couldn't control how my family would react. I could only hold to what was real, what was mine. By mid-morning, the living room had been rearranged for the gathering. My father sat rigidly in his chair, brow furrowed, worry in the lines around his mouth. Jane perched opposite, tense and expressionless. Beside me, Ms. Alvarez, my attorney, was the only person in the room whose confidence matched my dread. Across from her, 2 uniformed Maplewood police officers waited quietly, notepad in hand. There was public accountability, too. Katie, the journalist, present with her press badge, scribbling respectful but meticulous notes for the record. For a fleeting moment, I looked around and saw all the versions of myself in this room. The trusting child who clung to Aunt Jane's stories, the lonely teenager who questioned her own sanity, the wounded young woman determined to reclaim what was stolen. In my chest, terror and hope converged. Ms. Alvarez nodded subtly. "Go ahead." I took a deep breath, my hands only shaking slightly. I called this meeting because the silence almost destroyed me, because secrets gut families more surely and more quietly than any public shame. Today, I can't keep those secrets anymore. I pulled out my documentation, placing it on the coffee table for all to see. "Jane, these are records of missing funds, forged signatures, unapproved withdrawals. Here are emails between you and your lawyer about granting yourself access to the trust and changing beneficiary status without my father's knowledge. This is a recording of you calling the bank and pretending to be me. The air thickened. The hum of the heating system. The smallest shift in my father's breathing. The quiver of Jane's hand as she reached for a tissue. The officers stayed silent, letting the evidence speak first. I played the first audio file. Jane's voice, crisp and distinct, discussing moving funds quietly and ensuring Emily doesn't find out until she's older. I watched my father's face collapse, sorrow and betrayal overtaking confusion. Ms. Alvarez presented the forged documents, matched old signatures with forged ones, and spelled out the likely consequences by New Jersey law. Jane didn't cry. Not at first. She shook her head. You've never understood what it takes to keep a family together, Emily. After your mother died, it all fell to me. All the pressure. I did what I thought was best. I steadied my own voice, surprised by the clarity that came. You did what you thought was best for you, not for me, not for Dad. You took what didn't belong to you, and you lied to both of us. You taught me to trust you, then used that trust as cover. Shame flickered across Jane's face. For a split second, I saw the woman who'd once baked me muffins, sung lullabies, and insisted we were each other's anchors. But the truth of what she'd done, the deliberate nature of it, was out in the open now, and it could not be stuffed back into the shadows. Katie, ever the observer, finally broke the silence to clarify the timeline for her notes. That simple act made it all so real. Details formed not just my story, but a record for the larger world. What happened here mattered. My father, tears brimming for the first time I could remember, put his hand on mine. He turned to Jane. Why didn't you just tell me the truth? We could have survived almost anything, but not this. Jane looked away, cheeks wet, words failing. The officers stepped in, calmly reading her the preliminary complaint that would begin a formal legal process. Ms. Alvarez outlined the likely steps: a full investigation, court appearances, restitution hearings. Jane would face justice, not out of spite, but because this was how trust is repaired. Not by pretending nothing's broken, but by holding the fractures up to the light. There were other family members present via video call. My mother's brother, my grandmother in her chair. Some refused to look at the evidence. Some sobbed. One simply left the screen. That multiplicity of response hurt, but I expected it. Some wounds, I'd learned, would never heal fully. I could have looked away. I could have withdrawn my complaint, protecting Jane at the expense of myself. But I didn't. In the presence of my entire family, my biological roots, my chosen circles, even my community, I claimed my place. My voice shook less as I finished. No one should be made to doubt themselves for speaking the truth. Not ever. Not in this family. Afterward, the room emptied slowly. The police led Jane out gently. No cuffs, but with a formal air. Ms. Alvarez hugged me tight, proud and spent. My father didn't speak, but he stayed by my side. Katie closed her notebook. Her eyes, usually unflinching, were soft with empathy. The silence that followed was different. Not the old, suffocating hush of secrets kept, but the deep, tired quiet after a great storm. The kind of silence in which things can start to mend. For the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe. In confronting everyone, I wasn't just reclaiming my inheritance or my reputation. I was reclaiming my right to truth and setting the precedent that silence would no longer be the currency of our family story. I didn't know what would come next. Court, more whispers, perhaps new forms of loss. But I knew my future was finally, fiercely, my own. Final chapter: true freedom and real worth. The days after the confrontation blurred together. a haze of exhaustion in therapy sessions, court appearances, and hesitant reunions. There is no neat resolution to family betrayal, and no judge's order or police signature could return the years Jane took or the innocence I lost. Yet for the first time in my life, I felt the strange lightness of having nothing left to hide, of finally, fiercely, telling the truth, no matter how difficult it was to speak. The legal process with Jane was not cinematic or cathartic. Lawyers argued over restitution, timelines, and the restitution of financial assets. With the facts and evidence I'd gathered, Jane was compelled to return a large portion of my inheritance. The house and the savings my mother left came back to me, but the money itself was almost an afterthought compared to what had been shattered between us. Still, when the judgment arrived, a formal letter, legal stamps, a bank transfer that was somehow both momentous and anticlimactic, I felt some symbolic justice click into place. It was closure, but not an ending. Jane's sentencing was modest by the standards of television drama. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic courtroom revelations, just a quiet hearing, community service, mandatory financial counseling, and court-ordered restitution. For some in town, it was a scandal. For others, a sad family affair to be pitied and quickly forgotten. I rarely left the courthouse with a sense of triumph. If anything, I felt humility, a kind of awe at how close I'd come to letting my story be buried, and to remaining trapped by silence. The real prison, I saw now, wasn't a jail cell or legal penalty. It was the part of myself I had nearly surrendered to appease others' comfort and pride, redefining home. Even after the legal process ended, the hardest work remained, rebuilding a home and identity from the fragments Jane left behind. The house, once so full of tradition, birthday streamers, Sunday music, the smell of cinnamon in the fall, now felt cavernous and strange. My father, lighter with relief but heavier with regret, tried his own form of reconciliation. He started joining me for dinner again, sometimes silent, sometimes apologetic, always tentative. I cleaned out Jane's room over a weekend, boxing up her books and remnants, her perfumes, and the faded greeting cards she used to leave by my breakfast plate. I stumbled across old photographs. Jane as a girl, Jane beaming at my mother's wedding, Jane hugging me after a school play. For every betrayal, a reminder that love, once so real, had also been weaponized. That paradox haunted me, but I refused to let it curdle into cynicism. I allowed myself to mourn, not just what was lost, but what, for a time, had truly been good. Our family became much smaller and more honest. Days passed, and trust, so long shattered, began to rebuild, not in grand gestures, but in ordinary rituals. My father showing up to my track meets, or returning the car keys with a joking reminder to drive safe, Em. With each meal shared in quiet understanding, we learned to forgive, not to forget, but to move forward, finding myself beyond the wreckage. Freedom, I learned, is not just the removal of chains, but the power to choose your own story. For so long, my identity was defined by other people's expectations. Jane's version of me as the protected child, the town's version of the privileged Parker girl, my past self trapped between loyalty and self-preservation. Now, those stories no longer fit. I had to become the author of my own narrative. I decided not to transfer colleges, despite the whispers and wary glances that sometimes trailed me through the grocery store aisles. I joined the student newspaper, using my voice for the first time in ways that had nothing to do with defense or accusation. My first published essay was titled "The Cost of Silence," a masked account of betrayal, of what happens when someone you trust most is the one unraveling your world. The response from readers, strangers sharing their own stories, classmates offering quiet nods in the hallway, surprised me. I realized how common it was to feel voiceless, to have your sense of reality warped by people who insist their lie is the truth. Therapy became a regular part of my life, not a sign of weakness, as Jane used to imply, but an act of defiance and hope. I worked with a kind but frank therapist, Dr. Strong, whose name always made me smile with its aptness. She helped me untangle which parts of myself belonged to me and which were inherited, adopted, or forced upon me by others' needs. There were weeks when all I could do was cry, and other times I found myself laughing, finally, awkwardly, at the absurdity of carrying so much alone. Hannah, my steadfast friend, was a constant presence. Together, we created new traditions. Late-night ramen, road trips to the shore, spontaneous movie marathons with bad horror films. She never once asked for the whole story. She just accepted me, stitches and scars included. With her, trust grew back, slow but sturdy. Reimagining family, rewriting value. What I learned most profoundly was that real worth isn't calculated in bank accounts or in the eyes of a gossiping town. Real worth is waking up and not shrinking yourself to fit someone else's comfort. It is recognizing that your pain, your words, your selfhood matter, regardless of whether others approve or believe. There were extended family members who never forgave me. My grandmother wrote terse, brittle letters, doubting my choices. An uncle shook his head at reunions, lamenting all that dirty laundry in public. Some friendships drifted for good, casualties, not just of scandal, but of diverging values. I let them go. For each loss, I found something truer in its place. Authentic, mutual connections, forged not from legacy or obligation, but from empathy and shared experience. My relationship with my mother's memory also changed. For years, I treated it as an untouched relic, something Jane curated and protected. Now I could finally grieve for my mom as a real person, not an absent saint. I wrote her letters I never sent, telling her about Jane's cracks and my own. I imagined her response. Not judgment, but the warmth of someone who understood that forgiveness is active, not passive. The best parts of my mother, the laughter, the resilience, the stubborn optimism, felt closer than they had in years. Freedom's quiet power. There were no dramatic epiphanies at the end, just a gradual settling into myself. I stopped worrying about being the lucky girl everyone pitied or envied. I let myself be ordinary and spectacular, anxious and brave. Some nights, I still woke up believing I heard Jane humming in the next room, only to remember that I, and not some mythical family harmony, was now responsible for my own safety. Other times, I marveled at just how much I could endure, and how the wounds left by betrayal could heal, not by pretending they were never there, but by caring for them until they stopped defining me. In a small way, I even reclaimed Maplewood itself. At the town's annual fall festival, where once my family posed for perfect photos on the green, I volunteered to help run the book sale table. No longer hiding, no longer shrinking. I told my story when asked, and sometimes I just smiled and chatted about paperbacks and pumpkin pie. There was relief in participating on my own terms, looking toward a self-made future. Sometimes, people ask what I would say to someone going through the kind of pain I survived. I think of all the things I tried to tell my past self. It's not your fault. Trust is precious, but it isn't blind. Love and truth are sometimes on opposite sides of the room, and you have to choose which to stand with. True freedom isn't the absence of scars. It's knowing you don't have to hide them. And real worth, I've found, is claiming your own place in the story, refusing to accept someone else's version when it contradicts your reality. I'm not grateful for Jane's betrayal. I'll never call what she did a blessing in disguise. But I am grateful for the stubborn ember of voice that survived it, for the community I built from the ruins, for becoming a person who no longer equates silence with loyalty. I still don't know how to answer every question about the future. Sometimes I wake with a heart still pounding from what I've lived through. But the ground beneath my feet is mine now. Uncertain, perhaps, but honest. Every day brings a chance to choose truth, to offer authentic love, to set new boundaries, to live with my head held high. This is what freedom looks like. Not perfect or unscarred, but whole, and at last, entirely mine.